A man walks into the brutal, blinding heat of the Arizona desert in the second week of June, 1931, carrying a map he believes will make him infinitely rich. He is 66 years old. He has a severe limp from an old injury. He takes enough supplies for a few days, waves goodbye to the men who brought him to the edge of the jagged peaks, and vanishes into the canyons. 6 months later, an expedition finds his skull resting on the desert floor, with 2 distinct holes in it. Weeks after that, they find his body, nearly a mile away from the skull, alongside a handwritten note that calmly states he has found the legendary gold he was looking for. There is no gold in his pockets. There is no explanation for how his body and his head ended up so far apart. And the official police report ultimately concludes that he probably just died of thirst. But long before this man, or any other prospector, ever set foot on this fractured terrain, the people who had lived in this desert for centuries already knew exactly what happened to humans who walked into these specific canyons. They did not call it a mystery. They called it a certainty. The Apache people had a name for this terrifying vertical maze of volcanic rock, and they treated it with a level of absolute dread that they applied to almost nowhere else on the continent. To them, there was no gold hidden in the stone. There was only a profound, ancient warning. Today, we are going to look at what the Apache actually said about this place long before the history books began, at the deeply unsettling police reports from the 20th century that document decades of bizarre deaths, at the physical reality of the ground itself, and at the strange way that an ancient legend and modern forensics point to the exact same chilling conclusion. To understand what is really waiting out there in the heat, we cannot start with the gold rush. We have to start with the people who knew better than to look for it. Imagine you are standing on the flat, dust-baked floor of the Sonoran Desert, looking east. Rising violently out of the scrub brush and the saguaro cactus is a fortress of dark, imposing stone. The peaks look like broken teeth tearing into the sky. The shadows they cast are long, black, and deceptive. These are the Superstition Mountains, an expanse of roughly 160,000 acres of some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. For the Apache, who mastered the art of survival in a landscape that would kill an unprepared outsider in a single afternoon, the desert was not an enemy. It was their home. They knew how to find water hidden in the roots of plants. They knew how to navigate by the stars and the subtle shifts in the wind. They understood the land with a scientific precision born of thousands of years of observation. And yet, when it came to this specific fortress of rock, their understanding led them to one absolute rule. You do not go in. According to their oral traditions, which were guarded carefully and spoken with deep reverence, these mountains were the sacred domain of the thunder god. The peaks were not meant for human eyes, and the deep, winding caves that honeycombed the lower canyons were considered gateways to the lower worlds, places of spiritual pollution and physical danger. The Apache believed that the winds sweeping through the canyons carried the voices of spirits who despised human presence. If you entered, you were not just trespassing on foreign soil. You were violating a fundamental boundary between the mortal world and the divine. To us, sitting comfortably in the modern era, it is incredibly easy to dismiss this as mere folklore. We hear about a thunder god, and we think of primitive mythology, of people trying to explain thunderstorms because they did not understand atmospheric pressure. But that is an arrogant and fatal misunderstanding of how indigenous memory works. To the people who lived there, this was not a fairy tale meant to frighten children. It was a cultural warning system. Oral tradition is an archive of survival. When an entire civilization, perfectly adapted to the harshest environments on Earth, collectively agrees that a specific geographical area is fundamentally hostile to human life, they are usually encoding a physical truth into a spiritual language. The Apache knew that the mountains were a trap. They warned that the landscape shifted, that the echoes deceived the ears, and that men who went into the deep canyons lost their minds before they lost their lives. They warned of sudden, violent storms that appeared out of nowhere, funneling flash floods through the narrow stone corridors, wiping away everything in their path. The tradition was clear. The mountain does not just kill you, it breaks your perception of reality first. If you enjoy tracing these lost pieces of history, the stories that fall through the cracks of the official record, consider subscribing to this channel, because we follow these archives wherever they lead. And in this case, the archive is about to shift from ancient spoken warnings to the cold, undeniable ink of written history. We are going to examine what happened when outsiders, completely ignorant of the Apache boundary, decided to cross it. We will look at the massive military and civilian expeditions that simply vanished, at the specific forensic anomalies found on the bodies of the victims, and at the precise geological nightmare that makes the Superstition Mountains so lethal. Because decades after the Apache finalized their warning, a completely different group of people arrived with wagons, rifles, and an insatiable hunger for wealth. And what they recorded in their journals and police files should not have matched the ancient legend at all. It was supposed to be an era of reason, of industry, of conquering the wild. But instead, the modern records ended up writing the exact same story the Apache had been telling all along. The real trouble begins in the middle of the 19th century, specifically around 1848. According to historical records from Mexico, a wealthy and powerful family named the Peraltas had discovered an incredibly rich vein of gold deep within the Superstition Mountains. They sent a massive expedition, dozens of men, pack mules, and specialized mining equipment into the heart of the canyons. They were not interested in local taboos. They were interested in extraction. But the Apache were watching. In the eyes of the indigenous people, these miners were not just stealing rock. They were desecrating the holiest and most dangerous ground in their territory. The result was inevitable. In a narrow, suffocating gorge that would later be named the Massacre Grounds, the Apache ambushed the Peralta expedition. The slaughter was absolute. The mules were scattered, the gold was supposedly hidden or abandoned, and the miners were wiped out. For the Apache, this was not a war for resources, it was a cleansing. They were enforcing the quarantine of the Thunder God's domain. But the story of the Peralta massacre did not keep people away. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It proved to the outside world that the gold was real. Fast forward to the 1870s, and a German immigrant named Jacob Waltz emerges from the Superstition Mountains carrying incredibly high-grade gold ore. He tells a few trusted people that he has found the lost Peralta mine. He keeps the location a total secret, and when he dies in 1891, he takes the exact coordinates to his grave. This is the birth of the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. From that moment on, the warning of the Apache is entirely erased from the public consciousness. No one cares about the Thunder God. No one cares about the shifting labyrinth. Thousands of desperate, greedy men begin pouring into the canyons, convinced that they are just one lucky strike away from becoming millionaires. And this is where the story stops being a historical footnote and becomes a deeply documented forensic nightmare. Because the men who went looking for Waltz's gold did not just fail to find it, they began to disappear in ways that completely shattered the standard expectations of desert survival. Let me show you exactly what I mean. I want you to look at the case of Adolf Ruth. By 1931, the legend of the Lost Dutchman was famous across the country. Ruth was not a rugged frontiersman. He was a former government employee from Washington, a bureaucrat who had become obsessed with the myth. He had somehow acquired what he believed was an authentic map to the mine, supposedly passed down from a descendant of the Peralta family. Despite his age, his injured leg, and his complete lack of desert survival skills, Ruth traveled to Arizona. The locals begged him not to go. They told him the heat was rising, that the canyons were impassable, and that men far stronger than him had vanished. Ruth ignored them. He was utterly confident. He was dropped off at a base camp known as First Water, and he walked into the jagged shadows. He was supposed to be gone for a few days. When a week passed with no sign of him, a massive search and rescue operation was launched. The police, local volunteers, and experienced trackers combed the canyons. They found his base camp. It was completely intact. His tent was pitched, his supplies were there, and nothing seemed out of place. But Ruth was gone. The search went on for weeks, but the terrain was so hostile, so utterly vertical and confusing, that they eventually had to give up. The desert had swallowed him. Then, in December of that same year, an archaeological expedition happens to be exploring a completely different part of the mountains, miles away from where Ruth had vanished. They find a human skull sitting in the dirt. It is sent to a medical examiner. Dental records confirm it belongs to Adolf Ruth. But there is a massive problem. The skull has 2 holes in it. Furthermore, there is no skeleton anywhere near it. How does a man's head end up miles away from his camp, completely separated from his body? The authorities are baffled. Weeks later, in January of 1932, another search party finally finds the rest of Ruth's remains. The body is located in a small tributary canyon, nearly a mile from where the skull was found. And here is the part that should not be possible. Beside the headless body is Ruth's checkbook. Inside it, a handwritten note. It provides a detailed description of the landscape, claiming he has found the legendary mine. And it ends with the Latin phrase, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. He signed his name below it. Now, look at what this means. We have a man who supposedly dies of exposure in the desert, yet he has the presence of mind to write a calm, triumphant note in his checkbook. His body is found miles from his camp, in terrain he could not possibly have navigated with a severe limp. And his skull is found another mile away with 2 suspicious holes. The official explanation was simple, and for a while everyone accepted it. They said he died of thirst and that animals scattered his remains. As for the holes in the skull, the authorities claimed they were bite marks from coyotes, or perhaps damage from the rocks. But it left 3 things completely unexplained. Animals do not typically carry a human skull a mile across steep ravines, while leaving the rest of the bones perfectly intact. A man dying of the agonizing hallucinatory pain of extreme dehydration does not neatly write a philosophical Latin quote in a checkbook. And the map he brought with him, the one thing he valued more than his life, was missing from his pockets. So the authorities faced a choice: either acknowledge that something violent and inexplicable was happening in the mountains, or brush it under the rug as a tragic accident of nature. The official line held firm. Ruth died of natural causes. The mountains are dangerous, they said, because the heat is brutal and the water is scarce. End of story. There is no curse. There is no mystery. Just foolish men making fatal mistakes. But this is where we have to pause and push back against the comfortable official narrative. Because when you look closer at the archives, when you actually read the historical accounts from the 1940s, the 50s, and the 60s, you realize that Ruth was not an anomaly. He was the start of a terrifying pattern. Investigators who bothered to look beyond the surface found that the official explanation of thirst and animals was mathematically and physically falling apart. Let us methodically weigh the arguments. The skeptics and the official institutions maintain a very rational position. They argue that the Superstition Mountains are incredibly hot, reaching temperatures well over 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. They point out that dehydration causes delirium, leading victims to wander erratically, discard their clothing, and eventually collapse. They argue that the promise of gold attracts desperate, heavily armed men, and that any violence in the mountains is simply the result of miners murdering each other over claims or supplies. If a map goes missing, it is because a rival stole it. If a body is mutilated, it is because of scavengers or the brutal elements. It is a harsh, clean, completely mundane explanation, and for many cases, this is absolutely true. The desert is merciless. But there was something none of them had checked yet, and when someone finally did, the whole case changed shape. When independent forensic experts and seasoned desert trackers examined the details of the superstition deaths, the mundane explanation began to collapse under the weight of physical evidence. Take the holes in Adolf Ruth's skull. Years later, respected anthropologists examined the photographic and physical evidence. The holes did not match the irregular crushing impact of coyote jaws. They were highly uniform. In fact, they looked exactly like the entry and exit wounds of a high-caliber bullet. If Ruth was shot in the head, why did the police insist on a natural death? Ask yourself why the record would simply gloss over a potential murder. Perhaps because admitting there was a killer loose in the labyrinth would require sending officers in to find him, a task no one wanted to do. But the artifacts and the bodies were only part of the problem. Over the next few decades, the mountains claimed dozens of lives, and the details grew increasingly disturbing. In the 1940s, a man named James A. Cravey entered the mountains by helicopter, searching for the gold. He was dropped off at a high elevation, well-equipped. He told the pilot to come back for him later. He never showed up at the rendezvous point. Months later, his headless body was found tied in a blanket. His skull was found completely separate, a considerable distance away. Sound familiar? Again, the authorities blamed animals and exposure. In the 1950s and 60s, prospectors were found shot dead in their sleeping bags. Others were found with their camps completely untouched, a pot of coffee still sitting on a cold fire, their rifles fully loaded leaning against a rock, while the men themselves had vanished without a trace, their remains found months later in ravines they had no logical reason to enter. Notice the pattern here. This is not the typical behavior of people suffering from heat exhaustion. People dying of thirst do not tie themselves in blankets. They do not leave fully stocked camps to climb down into impassable, jagged ravines. And coyotes do not systematically decapitate victims and leave the rest of the body behind. Every time investigators tried to close the case, one piece of evidence pulled it back open. This brings us to the most crucial, physical layer of the mystery, the geology of the Superstition Mountains themselves. When you speak to modern geologists and seasoned search and rescue teams, they will tell you something that sounds eerily similar to the ancient Apache warnings. The Superstition Range is formed from volcanic ash and compressed magma, the remnant of massive volcanic activity millions of years ago. As a result, the rock is rich in iron and other highly magnetic minerals. Compasses behave erratically here. Modern GPS devices can lose signal in the deep, winding slots. The canyon walls are sheer and vertical, rising thousands of feet, blocking out the sun and creating shadows that physically alter the perception of depth and distance. Furthermore, the acoustics of the canyons are deeply anomalous. A rock falling a mile away can echo down a narrow chute and sound like a footstep right behind you. The wind rushing through the jagged spires genuinely sounds like human voices, a low, constant moan that grates on the nerves. You can stand on a ridge, look down at a landmark, walk for an hour, and realize you are entirely turned around because the repetitive shapes of the volcanic pillars look identical from different angles. Now put it together. The legend warned of spirits that break the mind. The police reports recorded men wandering inexplicably away from survival, found in bizarre, illogical locations. And modern science confirms that the physical environment is a sensory deprivation chamber made of magnetic, acoustic, and visual illusions. 3 sources, separated by centuries, none of them connected, all describing the same impossible thing. We are left with a situation where the official, skeptical explanation of simple heat exhaustion is statistically inadequate. It cannot explain the missing heads, the bullet holes, or the bizarre psychological state of the victims before they died. Conversely, the idea that a literal thunder god or a ghostly Spanish miner is murdering people is something the historical record cannot verify. So we are forced into a very uncomfortable middle ground. Something real, physical, and profoundly dangerous exists in those mountains. It is violent enough to leave a trail of broken bodies spanning a century, and deceptive enough to remain entirely undocumented by formal institutions. Everything now points in one direction. The warnings of the elders, the bloody forensic files of the 20th century, and the hard, magnetic rock of the canyon walls all agree. And the thing they agree on is the one thing no one wanted to be true when the gold rush began. Which brings us to the single question this whole story has been building toward. What is the actual curse of the Superstition Mountains? So here is what actually happened. Not the ghost story, not the dismissive police summary, but the version every piece of evidence finally points to. The curse of the superstitions was never magic, and it was never supernatural. It was something far more terrifying because it was entirely real. The Apache and the modern police reports were never in conflict. They were describing the exact same phenomenon from 2 ends of history, one as a cultural warning, the other as a tragic aftermath. What connected them was the mountain itself. The Superstition Range is an apex predator of a landscape. It is an environmental trap so perfectly designed to destroy human psychology and physiology that the indigenous people had no choice but to codify it into a strict religious taboo. When the Apache said the mountains belonged to the thunder god and that the caves were polluted with evil, they were effectively putting a biohazard label on the terrain. They understood that the extreme temperature swings, the lack of water, the disorienting acoustics, and the identical volcanic spires induce a very real, documented psychological collapse known as desert madness. When a human being enters that specific labyrinth, the brain's spatial processing breaks down. The magnetic anomalies render basic navigation useless. The mind, starved of water and bombarded by false echoes, turns on itself. This is why experienced men left their fully stocked camps. This is why they wandered into impassable ravines without their rifles. The mountain broke their perception of reality, just as the Apache warned it would. And as for the missing heads, the bullet holes, and the stolen maps, this is where the human element amplifies the natural trap. The legend of the Lost Dutchman acted as a psychological poison. It drew in the most desperate, paranoid, and violent men of the era. The mountain did not need a ghost to kill the prospectors. It just provided the perfect isolated arena for greedy men to murder each other. A man succumbs to the disorientation of the canyons. A rival miner stalks him, shoots him for his map, and leaves the body to the brutal elements. The flash floods and the scavengers do the rest, tearing the skeleton apart, washing a skull a mile down a dry riverbed. Think back to the evidence we laid out. The identical Native American warning, the specific forensic anomalies of Adolph Ruth and James Cravey, the geological reality of the magnetic acoustic stone. Each one, alone, could be dismissed as a coincidence or a mistake. Together, they form a flawless, interlocking system. The Apache understood the system perfectly. They knew that if you introduce human greed into a landscape that systematically destroys human sanity, the result is mass death. We may never prove every single detail of who pulled the trigger on Adolph Ruth, or where exactly Jacob Waltz found his gold, if he ever truly did. We simply cannot know everything at this distance in time. But of every explanation ever offered, this is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. The mountain is exactly what the indigenous people said it was, a place inherently hostile to the human mind. The gold rush miners stripped away the ancient warning, replaced it with the illusion of wealth, and walked willingly into a meat grinder. And that is the quiet weight of it. Not a lost treasure hidden by a vanished race, but a lethal geographical reality, powerful enough to outlast the people who respected it, and violent enough to continually destroy the people who ignore it. But the answer is not really where this story ends, because what it tells us about ourselves is the part that lingers. We like to think that history moves in a straight line from primitive superstition to modern enlightenment. We look at an indigenous oral tradition about a thunder god and a forbidden mountain, and we confidently assume we know better. We map the terrain from satellites, we carry GPS devices, and we assume the landscape is ours to conquer. But this story is proof that knowledge does not always move forward. The Apache held a piece of vital, life-saving data, a perfect understanding of environmental limits. They survived by knowing what not to touch. Our society arrived with technology and arrogance, dismissed the warning as folklore, and spent the next century retrieving our dead from the ravines. Maybe the real lesson here is not about what happened to Adolph Ruth or the Peralta miners. It is about how much we lose when we label something a myth and stop listening. Those people were trying to tell us something critical for hundreds of years. They encoded their geography into their religion to make sure the warning survived the passage of time. And we ignored it because it was not written on official paper. Remember the image we started with? The jagged black peaks rising out of the desert, casting long shadows over the sand? Look at that image again now. It is not just a pretty piece of scenery anymore. It is a monument to a forgotten boundary. Some doors, once someone warns you about them, you never walk past the same way again. So I want to ask you this. Is there a story like this where you live? A specific forest, an old road, or a stretch of water that the oldest locals avoid for reasons they cannot entirely prove but refuse to ignore? A warning that everyone knows but no one writes down? Tell me about it in the comments. I genuinely read them, and the discussions under these videos are half the reason I keep making them. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the stories where the archives run out and the ancient memory begins, then subscribe to the channel. That is the only way you will catch the next investigation, and there are far stranger records waiting in the dark. If this case kept you here to the very end, leaving a like genuinely helps more people find the channel. That is not a small thing. It is the exact reason independent research like this can survive on this platform. Thank you for staying with me all the way through the labyrinth. Keep asking why the quiet places are quiet, and I will see you in the next one.